So welcome everybody. My name is Lena Slackmulder, and I co-chair the Council on Tech and Social Cohesion. This was created about 2 years ago as a way of trying to influence tech design to foster trust and cohesion rather than polarization and violence. And what's really unique about it is it brings together technologists, peace builders, academics, and policy influencers, all who are really trying to focus on how can technology really bolster social cohesion? How can we understand what that means? How can we look at different design features? What kinds of policies could enable that? And this particular report, Prevention by Design, really harnessed the insights of that cross-sectoral membership of the Council by leaning on insights from Search for Common Ground's work together with GBV-focused civil society organizations working across South Asia in response and advocacy around tech-facilitated gender-based violence, together with technologists from the Integrity Institute, which is really a leading organization working to advance a social internet where individuals, societies, and democracies thrive. And the Integrity Institute has dozens and dozens of fellows who are or have been in trust and safety and integrity and product teams. And so this Prevention by Design is a culmination of that kind of collaboration. Next slide. So today, as we gather to look at how we can tackle tech-facilitated gender-based violence at the source, I want to just highlight a couple things of why this is so important. Wherever we've looked across the world, we've found that women and girls and non-binary individuals are facing this chilling effect caused by abuse and harassment, which is reducing the available safe space for people to express themselves and for free speech to exist. This is combined with the growth of online misogyny, which is more and more being seen as a correlating factor in the support for violent extremism. And thus is not only harming women, but is also reaching into harm for men and boys as well, who are finding online misogyny an increasingly normal norm online. And what we see is the responses, whether it's content takedowns, awareness raising, or prosecutions of perpetrators, many of these are limited and reactive to the harm. We're also seeing that more and more regulators are looking at this aspect of safety by design rather than enforcement as a way of trying to tackle tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And we see that right now in the open for consultation guidance from Ofcom on online safety for women and girls. And last year, we saw a really powerful report from Australia's e-commissioner entitled Tech, Gendered Violence and Safety by Design, a Guide for Industry. Next slide. And so as we look then at why this design approach in responding to TFGBV matters, it really comes down to a couple set of insights that really inspired us to do this work together. Although gender-based violence has existed for decades, we see that the way in which technology has been designed and is being used, it enables and accelerates and amplifies these harms. And so as opposed to only looking at what is it about the abuser or the victim of that abuse and how can we protect them, we're really asking the question, what is it about platform design that could be built differently, that could be built to mitigate that harm, to prevent it, to even intercept it? And so many of the recommendations that are based on evidence of things that platforms are doing, things that researchers have studied, we'll hear about nudges and filters and other things, are things that can be deployed by platforms today. Next slide. So I'm going to now pass it over to my collaborator from the Integrity Institute, Sophia Bonilla, who's the communications lead, and she'll take us through the rest of the agenda for today. Again, thank you all for joining, and then we're going to try to really make sure that we leave time for questions and answers. because we see that there's been just a huge diversity of people from civil society, peace building groups, policy influencers, regulators, academics that are all joining us today. Over to you, Sophia.
Hi, thank you, Lena, for that framing and for helping us understand the importance of today's conversation. Hello, everyone. I'm Sophia Bonilla. I work on TFGBV at the Integrity Institute, and as Lena said, I'll be moderating today's discussion. We have the agenda up on the screen to give you a little preview of our session today. A quick bit of housekeeping. If you could please input your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can submit them throughout the webinar, but as Lena said, we'll get to them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And with that, I will introduce our first speaker. Darini Priscilla is an independent researcher and consultant based in Sri Lanka. Darini's work centers on building safer and inclusive online spaces for vulnerable communities through research, advocacy, and storytelling. Darini, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening. I want to begin by acknowledging that platforms do support victims and survivors of TFGBV. But the thing is, this support is often reactive, right? Their approach is largely doing damage control, meaning, for example, taking down harmful content once you report it or blocking an abuser once they've done something. And again, these are very important, but the thing is, safety is not something that should be an afterthought, right? You cannot provide safety after the incident has happened. You can only provide care. So today, I think what we really want to do is talk to you about the lack of preventative safety. And from me, I really want to focus on the gaps in platform design and how these gaps are making things more difficult for people who are experiencing TFGBV. So I want to focus on 5 things. I'll try to be quick. The first one is the lack of inclusivity in community standards. Now, the community standards are very diverse, they're very broad, but the issue with the community standards is that they are largely shaped by people and perspectives from the global north. And this means that they fail to account for a lot of cultural and contextual nuances of TFGBV. A quick example that I can give you is that there was this person who reached out to us in Sri Lanka, and she found a picture of herself and her partner circulating. They were in a park, they were holding hands, they were just talking, but it was like a secluded park. And this picture was making rounds on WhatsApp and Facebook. And she wanted to take it down because in my culture, being photographed with a boy in a secluded space can be damaging because of the social norms here. So when we sent this to Facebook saying, hey, this was non-consensually posted, this person did not, consent to this, this is a private picture, the response that I got was, oh, this does not classify as intimate content. This is not private for us. And that begs the question, who gets to decide what intimacy means? Who gets to decide what sex means, what relationships mean? So this kind of content moderation, especially when the benchmarks are set by very narrow cultural and social lens, leave out a lot of TFGBV experiences, right? They get declassified, like in the case that I mentioned. The second gap is that a lot of these platforms are unable to keep up with evolving language trends. We know that technology with AI especially is evolving fast. And when technology evolves fast, the way we use it and the language that we use with it is also evolving fast. We see that a lot of people, especially young people, adapting the language and the behavior that they use to bypass a lot of moderation filters. If we take TikTok as an example, TikTok bans or monitors a lot of words like rape, suicide, porn, kill, murder, things like that. But what we see is people again bypassing this with codified language. Instead of saying porn, we see people using the corn emoji. Instead of saying rape, we see the grape emoji. Instead of saying suicide, they use the word unalive. So using codified language allows harmful content to exist in these spaces, especially gendered hate speech. And the thing is, it's not about filtering all of these words, right? I could easily give these words or a list to Facebook or TikTok, and they can take it down or be more mindful of these words. But the thing is, you need to continuously look for these languages, these changes. And what is lacking in the platform design is that adaptive approach. The third thing, and something that I see a lot, is the lack of cross-platform coordination. When an incident of TFGBV happens, especially when it is sharing of intimate, non-consensual intimate images or intimate content, this kind of content hardly stays, isolated in one platform. So if somebody leaked a picture on Facebook, it gets downloaded and goes to Instagram. And then on Instagram, somebody takes a screenshot and puts it on WhatsApp. And somebody takes all of this and then makes a video on TikTok, right? So the same content exists on multiple platforms. And what we see again and again is survivors going to multiple platforms and saying the same thing and trying to take down one picture from multiple places. It shouldn't be that difficult. You shouldn't have to go to so many people to try to take down one picture. And this is where cross-platform coordination would be so helpful, especially with tech companies like Meta that manage multiple platforms, right? But the problem is these tech companies, as we know, are very capitalistic in nature and they work in silos. So it creates that cycle of, survivors getting tired and exhausted of going to multiple platforms and asking them to take it down. There are simple processes like hashing, which are used by civil society organizations in some instances, where you can use it to take down or block a certain picture or content across multiple platforms, but they're not done. It's not being practiced by the tech companies because there is no collective responsibility. The fourth one is that the gap that we've noticed is that a lot of these platforms are designed for openness. So privacy is not offered by default. If you create a Facebook account or a TikTok account, the content is immediately public, right? You have to go and change your settings to private in order to allow your privacy. And even things like your geolocation, your microphone, you have to know to turn it off. It doesn't automatically turn it off. And what we've noticed with the people that we work with, especially people who are vulnerable to TFGBV and people who have low digital literacy, we notice that they are unaware of these tools and these settings until after something happens. So the concern is that why is privacy a hidden feature? Right? Why is it not an integral part of onboarding where you understand the difference between a public profile and a private profile? For us, for me at least, it's as simple as saying, hi, welcome to this platform. Here are your options. Choose whatever feels safest and comfortable to you. If you want, you can, come back and change it at any time. It's as that simple. And the last one is that, especially with what recent research has revealed, these platforms really need to reevaluate how they define TFGBV. Because TFGBV, similar to gender-based violence, does not always happen from strangers, right? Research shows that you are more likely to be abused online from people you know, from partners, from colleagues, co-workers, whoever. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that IPV, intimate partner violence, is reinforced through social media and digital devices. But the thing is, IPV or intimate partner violence does not happen through visible content. So it's not like my husband or my partner is posting nudes of me on social media platforms. It does happen, but IPV mostly happens through certain coercive control behaviors. So for example, we have abusive partners demanding access to passwords. We have partners monitoring who the other partner is interacting with. We have instances of controlling what and where they post. We have many instances of partners insisting that the other person turns their location on when they are, alone. These are all abusive behaviors, right? These are behaviors that include surveillance and control, where the digital platform or the social media platform is used as a tool of abuse. But because the behaviors that said are not reportable content. It's not an image or it's not a post. It's not reportable content. These platforms say that these behaviors fall outside of the scope of their responsibility, right? So basically they're saying, oh, it's not happening because of us, but it is happening through them, right? It's happening through the platform. So the platform is still part of that cycle of violence. So that creates the question, and I think this should be a broader question for us today. What does preventative justice look like in this context? What does preventative justice look like in the context of TFGBV? And also, what responsibilities do platforms have when their design and their features can be weaponized in relationships, both online and then offline, right? The answers to these questions are pretty simple, at least as a start, right? Embedding digital literacy education or digital rights education, especially during onboarding, that would be really helpful. But again, not done, right? Tech companies are scared to do it. Whenever we've spoken about this, especially in the South Asian context, when we talk about these things, they say, oh, but we don't want to scare them. We don't want to talk about violence. We don't want to talk, this would happen to you. But it's not about scaring or alarming users. It's about informing them and empowering them with the knowledge and the tools, right? So yeah, those are the 5 gaps that I wanted to kind of share with you. There's more, but these are some of the things that have been happening a lot in the recent years. And I want to conclude by going back to what I said at the very beginning, that safety or online safety requires intentional and proactive effort, right? True safety is not taking down something in 24 hours and helping somebody after it happened. True safety is empowering people and building systems and features that allow people to feel safe when they use it. And right now, what we see is a lot of these platforms are having fire extinguishers, offering civil society and other people fire extinguishers and saying, hey, okay, let's put this out, let's put this fire out. But what we really want to see and what we hope we all can advocate for in the future is to build spaces, build platforms, and build buildings that don't keep catching fire every other week, right? That would make things safer, more impactful, and effective for everybody. So I'll stop there. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Darini, for centering the lived experience of survivors and emphasizing that design choices really do have real-world impacts that aren't evenly distributed across users. Moving on, joining us next is Sarah Amos, a former journalist turned product leader. She specializes in AI-enabled technologies that help detect and mitigate online harm. Sarah currently works on TFGBV programming at Humane Intelligence. Sarah's going to walk us through some of the behavior-focused interventions that platforms can take to reduce harm.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to talk about this. So, as Darini noted, at the moment, we are still in a very reactive phase for platforms responding to TFGBV harms. But what I'm going to walk us through today are some existing measures that some platforms have certainly taken, though it's definitely my opinion, and I'm sure many others on the channel, that it could be increased, right? More platforms could be undertaking these design choices, or platforms that already have could go beyond what they are currently doing and increasing their robustness across the board. So that way we can go from simply reducing toxicity to approaching this in a gendered lens and in a survivor-centric way to address the unique nuances of TFGBV. And so what I'm going to talk about today, like Sophia noted, is nudges, filters, and onboarding campaigns. And why we're starting with this is because if you think about safety by design, there's a quote I always think of from Benjamin Franklin: "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." And with this, when we think about online harms, I often go through the framework in my head of that is used in the child safety space of 4 Cs. So if we think about how does online harm manifest, it manifests in terms of the content. The content itself is harmful regardless of who looks at it, if it just is out there on the platform. the conduct, so an individual perpetrator, perpetuating this harm onto a victim survivor. Contact, so the actual contact between a perpetrator and a victim survivor. And then lastly, contract. So if there are commercial engagements that are perhaps exploitative. I'm going to talk mostly about content, conduct, and contact today. And if we think about how can we use design choices to prevent or limit the content from being created, the conduct from occurring, and or the contact being made. And so if we look first at nudges on Instagram, and Sophia, you can go to the next slide. This is an example of us trying to prevent both the content from being created, or you could think of it as the conduct that is happening. And so if you look on the left-hand side, in this example, and Instagram has actually had this for a couple of years, what they do is they show a warning when someone tries to post a potentially offensive a comment. And especially then if they try to post it multiple times, this pop-up will increase and even link to the community guidelines, warning them that if they, continue to post this, that their comment may be hidden or removed. And what is interesting about this is Instagram's own research showed that in a 1-week study, it sent over 1 million nudges. And of those nudges in this course of this 1-week study, the users amended their comments 50% of the time. This is obviously a huge, result from such a study that I think can hopefully inspire Instagram to continue on this research or continue on this intervention, but also have other social media platforms follow suit. And this helps in terms of preventing from happening in the first place. However, if we think about trying to balance, free speech considerations or the risks of having too high of a recall, so detecting more of the time than it truly is, there's also another approach that can be used, and often these are best met when they are combined. And this is empowering a user to select their own content experience. And so an example of this would be filters on Blue Sky. So trying to empower the user to manage their own exposure to this content. So the idea behind this overall is a user should be able to create a safer, more positive environment for their own experience. It, in some ways, helps reduce the risk that platforms might fear of being seen as overly censorious. It doesn't necessarily help with the content problem, as I mentioned before, because that content might still exist. But at the very least, it helps prevent the contact problem as well as the conduct problem if it is something that a person can choose to block a person from, react of responding to them or getting in touch with them, or for the content exposure problem of being, given the opportunity to say, I don't want to see this type of content, or I want to see a warning before I see this type of content. And then lastly, I want to talk about onboarding. Because if we think about how to approach this in a proactive way as opposed to a reactive way, let's start at the very beginning. When a user joins an online community, there are certain norms associated with that community, and onboarding is an excellent opportunity to remind them of that. The problem is a lot of apps in general, this is not just for social media platforms, but really any app, is onboarding is such a crucial moment in what they call the user funnel. They don't want anyone to drop off. So in general, people in general don't want to have unnecessary questions or additional things. They just want to get the people into the platform as soon as possible. I would highly urge, though, companies to reconsider not integrating more an opportunity to reaffirm the norms of the platform. And so this is actually an example from Bumble. Dating apps especially have to take this into consideration because the health of their app depends on the health of the community and how comfortable and safe that users, especially in this case, Bumble being a very women forward dating app, how comfortable that they feel. So in this example, in part of the onboarding flow, it reminds a user as they're signing up what the community guidelines are, what the values are, and that, as part of being part of this community, like you, by agreeing to this and signing up for this, are also signing up to this set of rules. And I think it's also interesting because what Bumble did in this case is they tied it actually even to a marketing campaign. So it's not that trust and safety or TFGBV prevention measures have to be seen at odds with growth. Bumble led a survey that 87% of respondents agreed that kindness is a quality that they look for in a partner. So they actually tied it into their marketing campaign of kindness is cool, that they then tied to reaffirming the norms of that community. I'll wrap up by kind of going over how do you figure out when these nudges occur, right? Because whether it's a nudge or whether it is the opportunity to filter something, you have to decide when that might be. And just having nudges at any point of time is not necessarily the most effective way to do it. And so, how do these platforms figure this out? They use AI models. And I'll talk a little bit about content specific models, but my colleague after me, Gabe, will be talking a little bit more about just upstream general design solutions. So when it comes to the content itself, these are just two. There's many other approaches, but if we focus on text, there have existed for a while classifiers for hate speech. I do want to say, though, there is opportunity to improve this because it is difficult even in high resource languages such as English, and it is non-existent in most languages. There are many, organizations that are developing their own classifiers for low resource languages that I would highly encourage platforms to align themselves with and integrate into their own centralized detection. There's also what Darini mentioned of algo speak. So how people might use coded language or try to evade existing detection mechanisms, which is where human expertise is needed in addition to scaled out AI content detection. So a human team of experts that can work alongside the AI engineers like we already have today for cybersecurity risks or covert operation risks to find the unknown unknowns. How are perpetrators of TFGBV using coded language to conduct harm such as trafficking or novel forms of harassment, and making sure that that is included in terms of that detection technique. And then for media, of course, nudity detection models have porn filters, as they're often commonly told. They have existed for a while. However, this is where a nuanced approach is needed, as Darini mentioned, in terms of considering cultural forms of what might be considered an intimate image that is not strictly nudity, but also the problem that intimate image abuse is not just a nude image being online. It is rather the notion that it was non-consensually taken. And, you by over responding to detection of nudity, some platforms that allow nudity, that can be problematic because it doesn't want to be seen as being, not a place where people can consensually share their images. And so, as you can see, it's just a very complicated space in which we need to leverage human experts alongside the existing technical solutions. And that's also where the broad base of civil society actors who are these experts can be brought together with the tech companies in order to try to work towards a solution. So, yeah. So that's just a couple of behavior-focused interventions, but there, of course, are many more. And my colleague, Gabe, can actually continue talking about those.
Thank you so much, Sarah. As she mentioned, up next we have Gabe Freeman. Gabe is a user experience researcher currently leading a project to build a taxonomy of online TFGBV. To better equip trust and safety professionals with actionable solutions. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Gabe.
Thanks so much, y'all. So with these upstream design solutions, obviously there's an incredible amount of overlap between this and behavioral interventions. And I think a really important part of all of this is all of the ones that we cite in the paper are things that already exist in some capacity. Going back to the thing that was mentioned at the top, a lot of these teams are not only siloed from other companies, but they may be even siloed from each other or other parts of their organizations. These systems, like there's obviously a lot of different systems in place here. And actually, for the sake of just having a nicer visual, do you mind jumping over to the next slide? We have a number of different systems that are in place in some capacity on these different platforms. On Instagram, we have these report status things. but they are, as you might even be able to tell from looking at that little screenshot, kind of difficult to get to. And in many cases, they don't uh, keep the person updated as a partner in solving their own issues. There are other organizations that are outside of these tech companies that have been working to make this process easier, especially in cross-platform cases. This includes the Block Party, originally an API for Twitter, but when Twitter decided to not have that API anymore, they moved on to a Chrome extension. I highly encourage you to check them out if you have not already. There's also pirth.org, that's pirth.org. And then the Revenge Porn Hotline. They have an estimate that they've removed 90% of the content that was flagged to them, which is really high. As anyone who has ever tried to get anything taken off of one of these social media platforms can attest, that number does not feel normal. That's much, much higher. And that's because there are professionals who can take a look at this, can spend the time. Whereas these individuals who are often asked to go about managing their own cases, it's a huge amount of time investment in order to get these things taken care of. And so these organizations that are outside of these platforms are taking on a lot of this work and helping out in a lot of different ways. If someone here is from one of those social media platforms that has been in some sort of contact with these organizations, awesome. I highly encourage you to seek extending that partnership because they have the expertise on how to handle this stuff. They know how different platforms interact with each other and can help bridge that gap without as much fear as there often is around different social media platforms giving each other away their secrets. I also want to look at this TikTok sensitivity screen. This is such a simple solution of just, hey, we saw something, we're not exactly sure how bad it is, but being able to like quarantine this gray area content that we're not 100% sure we need to take off, but that might be kind of problematic. For people who are sensitive to these kinds of topics, they can skip it. For people who are willing to dive in, they have this moment of pause where they're able to enter knowing that there might be something sensitive on the other side, as opposed to scrolling through your feed and then suddenly seeing a disturbing image or something right next to your friend's dog photo, which is just obviously a whole experience. It also, I'll point out, is not good for revenue. If you are a social media platform, much of your money comes from advertising. Advertisers do not want to be next to a lot of sensitive content. And so this is, I think, a lot of the work that's done in this space is often seen as like anti-business in some capacity. And that's really not the case in almost all cases. Even if it is something that might have a short-term effect. For example, moving away from engagement-based content ranking. This is something we talk about a lot in the paper, and I, of course, encourage you to read it. But this is something that all social media platforms have known for a long time can have damaging effects. In fact, we have a quote in the paper from Mark Zuckerberg saying that one of the biggest issues social networks face is that when left unchecked, people will engage disproportionately with more sensationalist and provocative content. That makes a lot of sense evolutionarily. If there is something presented to you and it is really scary or disturbing, you want to pay attention to that because it could be damaging to you. This is the same effect that happens with people passing by a car crash, is you're going to pay attention to it. That doesn't mean you want to see more car crashes, right? And what we've seen is that actually in 2012, YouTube switched from maximizing clicks, i.e. that kind of like immediate emotional reaction to click on something, to maximizing a combination of both clicks and watch time, i.e., did people continue to watch that video once they had clicked on it, once they got past the clickbait? And they reported, well, there was a short-term drop in clicks. There was a long-term increase in retention. For all of these social media platforms, retention is the biggest thing. So sensitive content, blocking that is good for business in the long term as well. Finally, looking at this third one here of rate limits. Rate limits are a common thing here. For those who are not familiar, it's just how many messages can you send out, how many comments can you send out, how many posts can you make, etc. And for the vast majority of people, they will never encounter these rate limits in their lives. But people who are spammers hit these rate limits very quickly all the time. And especially that is the case with these spammers who are creating multiple accounts very quickly and then using each of these different accounts to make a bunch of posts all at once. There's a very a relatively not simple solution, but a mitigation strategy here is just make it harder to post a lot when you are a new account. If you are a normal person and you have just made a new account, you're probably not going to be posting all that much. You might send out a bunch of messages inviting friends to connect with you, but you're still probably going to only do that for a little bit. You're not going to be adding 1,000 people in 20 minutes. And so these rate limits can do a ton to just lower that amount of spam content, amount of other posts by bots or people with harmful intent. All of this to say, there are a lot of solutions that are already out there in some capacity on some of these platforms. That is the main goal of this paper, is to point out we're already doing a lot of this. If you are a part of civil society, it's crucial that you are aware of what is actually already being done, of course, because it allows you to interface with these platforms who may not know about, even stuff on their own platforms in some cases, and helping them bring that circle, or bring that full circle and bring it so that it is a connected ecosystem of safety. There's a lot of stuff in the paper. I encourage you to go read it. If you have questions, very happy to talk about it. But a lot of this ends up being thinking about longer term, what are people going to want or not want versus shorter term. And obviously that's a hard thing in a capitalist stock market focused economy. But it is something that we are moving more towards. It's getting ahead of regulation in a lot of cases too, which again is good for business. So I think a lot of this comes down, can you make the argument to your business side to be able to make these better longer term decisions? I'll pause there. Sophia, if you want to take it.
Thank you so much, Gabe. That's actually a great segue into our next speaker. Theodora Skiadis. She is the Chief of Staff at Human Intelligence and is an Integrity Institute member. She has experience working in technology policy, national security, and international development spaces. Theo, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Sophia. And I think the best part of my background is that I started my career in the search for common ground robot office. So it comes full circle here. Alrighty. So for my session, I wanted to talk a little bit about challenges in implementation. There are silver linings to each of these, but as everyone knows, this is a challenging moment to be doing this work for a whole bunch of different reasons. So first is the fact that trust and safety teams have been downsizing since 2022 and continuing into 2023 and through the present day. A lot of the teams that have been doing this work have either been entirely or partially dismantled. Trust and safety, has grown in other spaces, but a lot of the will within the companies to address this work has diminished, which means that there are fewer people internally who can serve as partners in the kind of work that was being described earlier. Just as an example, I managed a trusted flaggers program for human rights defenders at Twitter, and we worked with nonprofits like Access Now, Frontline Defenders, and Article 19 to escalate issues on human rights, including on TFGBV. And that work stream is not active as far as I know anymore. And all of us who are working on that project are no longer at the company. And I also supported our Global Trust and Safety Council, which looked at issues like this. And again, that effort was dismantled in December 2022. Um, and so it's been hard, but the silver lining here is that a lot of us who are doing this work have moved into new spaces, and that there's been, in some ways, a flourishing of interest in this work, in civil society, in government, maybe in smaller technology companies or in other contexts. And so a lot of us who had built up expertise doing this work internally at companies are now deploying our energies in new environments. And so I think that's a real silver lining to this significant challenge. The second is gaps in regulation. So as we know, it is hard to pass regulation or legislation at the US federal level, but around the world as well, there are many barriers. And I think a silver lining is that there's new effort and new excitement around addressing these really challenging problems. So just to kick off this section, one statistic that I found very powerful is that the number of apps in app stores to digitally modify images has proliferated. A study of 1,200 teens has found that many know people who have had deepfakes made of them, and 1 in 8 young people personally know someone who has been the target of deepfake nudes while under the age of 18. So protecting youth is an especially daunting challenge. Um, and there are nuances legislatively when it comes to this issue. For example, the issue of minor on minor crime is challenging to address. I was recently at a summit at the Yale Digital Ethics Center where we were talking about addressing open source issues, and deepfakes was one issue that was described. And a legislator from Massachusetts was talking about how in Massachusetts, indicting a 13-year-old child can historically only be done as under the sex offender status. And this was viewed as quite prohibitive. And as a result, very little was done to meaningfully address the issue. And so there are new legislative efforts that are underway. For example, at the state level in California last year, California Governor Newsom signed into law 5 different bills tackling different aspects of deepfakes. Two of these were about the representation of individuals, and 3 related to deepfakes within elections. So one of these, AB 2602, looked at the use of AI generated digital replicas of living performers. And it basically mandated any contract allowing the use of a performer's digital likeness to include a specific description, and basically required consent for the representation of anyone who's living. Um, then 1836 prohibited the use of a digital replica for deceased individuals. Um, Additional bills, 2655, 2355, and 2839, all looked at deceptive, digitally altered content as it relates to elections. So during specified periods, disclosures, takedowns, and typically these were constrained within a specific set of days before and after an election. For example, AB 2839 specified, I believe, 120 days before and then 60 days after an election, although there were challenges later on. And then at the national level, the Take It Down Act is something that's been discussed recently. It passed both the US House and Senate as early as February, and then a few weeks ago, and is now before the president for signing, and it would criminalize image-based sexual abuse. The goal is that this act would protect underprivileged folks. However, there have been numerous concerns that actually it is possible to abuse what this bill is looking to do. And so, given the new geopolitical context we find ourselves in, the bill takes on new political ramifications. And so it's important that government, law enforcement, and platforms be held accountable. And so this is a widely discussed bill that is possibly going to be passed into law if the president signs it over the coming weeks. So there are a whole bunch of legislative efforts that are underway. I think it's worth noting that this is a really good opportunity for people who want to be involved, because for those of us in active democracies, theoretically, we have representatives who want to hear from their constituents. And so, especially on the issue of legislating deepfakes, which really should be a bipartisan issue, I think there's an opportunity for all of us to speak with our legislators about how important this issue is and why they need to prioritize it in their legislative efforts. So I think again, there are gaps and there are challenges, but there are some opportunities for us here as well. And then political and institutional resistance, and this really closely connects to the previous item, which is that there's just a lot of changing political priorities. I worked with the National Democratic Institute's Democracy and Technology team and gender teams over the last few years. We did a project looking at TFGBV first here in the US and then in Nairobi, Kenya, where we brought together 65 people from all over the world to address the issue with governments and also with platforms. But those teams have been impacted by recent political changes. The NDI Democracy and Technology team was entirely furloughed. Everyone on the team is looking for a new job. And I believe the same thing may have happened with the gender team. I can only imagine they've been impacted as well. And resources have been removed. So, for example, we worked with the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse. The website was actually taken down from the US government webpage. So a lot of the resources that have existed online to do this work are no longer visible. I believe even the report that we wrote for the conference in Nairobi last year was temporarily removed. I think it's been reinstated, but there was a time when it was taken down. And so because of the changing political climate, this introduces new, very daunting challenges when it comes to moving this important work forward. And it impacts too how companies are prioritizing this work. I think companies are seeing the changing political priorities and are reacting accordingly. For example, decisions to scale back DEI initiative at companies are reflective of or responsive to changing US political priorities. And this has global ramifications, of course. So to wrap things up, I think there are a whole bunch of real world barriers. The reduced size of trust and safety teams means that there are fewer people inside companies to do this work. Real regulatory gaps, historic and current, as well as new challenges, make it hard to address these issues from a government perspective, and changing political priorities and subsequent institutional changes are creating really powerful new barriers. At the same time, there's a lot of new interest, renewed interest, and a proliferation of talent in new spaces where folks are driving forward this work. I think it represents an opportunity for us in civil society and in other spaces to more effectively advocate for these changes. And I think if we're to walk away thinking about what we can do as individuals, I do think there's a real opportunity for us to speak with legislators. I know many of us have been doing that in our respective geographies, and I encourage folks to think about how each of you can try to take, build community, because the more that we do together, the more effective we will be, and participate in these processes moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insight, Theo. Continuing this conversation on regulation and adoption, we will now turn to Elodie Vial. She is a journalist and tech policy advisor working on DSA enforcement. Elodie will speak more to how some of these recommendations can be adopted and how we can make the case that healthier platforms serve everyone. Over to you, Elodie.
Thank you so much, Sophia. And yeah, Theo talk about the barriers and how it's going to be very difficult to implement these recommendations. I would say this is a big burden for civil society organization involved in this process. But what can we do? I feel this paper is already an excellent example of what value-driven people across different industries and fields can produce together when combining their efforts. And so the idea now is to implement these ideas within policy frameworks and translate these insights into concrete change for the user at the end of the day. So I think we must collectively build robust advocacy. I mean, several voices singing together the same refrain and creating the right incentives to get them implemented. So, of course, regulation is the key track that we're trying to leverage here. And particularly, I'm based in France, particularly in the EU. And right now, the EU policymakers and the regulators have different, actually, regulation to enforce. It's not only the Digital Services Act. I will go back to it in a second. This is also the EU AI Act, the Directive on Combating Violence Against Women and on domestic violence. The European Media Freedom Act. I work mainly with organizations supporting journalists and media outlets and unions of journalists, and they engaged with more proactively with the European Media Freedom Act, which is also in the process of being enforced. Concerning the DSA, the Digital Services Act, this is a real opportunity to get this recommendation that have been described, explained in the paper and during this presentation. Particularly, I think Article 34 on risk assessment and Article 35 on risk mitigation. Clearly, these features, this intervention can fall under Article 35 on risk mitigation because there are very concrete and actionable recommendations that can be implemented now and that can help the platforms to mitigate the risk, which is a legal obligation now under the DSA. The problem is that, regulators are facing also similar challenges. There's a lack of resources for them to implement this DSA and this regulation, even though there is a new the DSA enforcement team is in the process of hiring, I would say, a group of 60 people. So that's a lot for us in the EU. So they are in the process of, let's say, yes, reinforcing, strengthening their team to enforce the DSA. But as I work mainly with civil society organization, I would say that it's as said, it's an important burden also for them because they are involved in the process of the DSA enforcement because they provide evidence-based research and their communities are actually the user who are at the front line being impacted by I would say the product, the develops the platforms, and so it's very hard for the CSOs as well to engage in this process, and it's not a monolithic stakeholder. CSOs have different mandates, not exactly the same things on their plate, and defending the same communities and the same timeline. And they are not always also aligned in their recommendations. So I think that's also another, the goal here is to try to move forward to solutions, but that's another challenge. I think personally, I try to engage also with institutions that value multilateralism. As it has been said by Theo, we're today in a very different framework context, of course, with a weaponization of freedom of expression. And I think for policymakers, it's really important to move forward on regulation that don't undermine freedom of expression. And so I think the recommendations of this report can directly serve the work and ongoing work led by a few organizations, and I think some of them are in the room, such as the OSCE. This week I was also in Strasbourg in France for the at the Council of Europe, just for my the non-European people in the room, but also for the European people because it's very complicated. The Council of Europe is not a European Union's institution because the European Union entails its 27 countries, and the Council of Europe, it's 46 countries, and the mandate is to focus on defending human rights and actually women's rights particularly. And so this discussion was focused on safeguarding human rights by balancing regulation and innovation. And I feel that as I've been between the EU and the US for the last few years, it's really that this tension also that is today necessary to solve, and these recommendations developed in this paper can really pave the way to this. So just to wrap up, I also, in terms of challenges for common advocacy and how technologists and civil society can work together. We really have to focus also today on this meaningful dialogue between civil society organization and the VLOPs. There's a lot of discussions, for instance, in Brussels, where between CSOs and the platforms, and the civil society organization are not very happy with these discussions, to say the least, because the companies have tried many times to take public credit for this kind of engagement, like ticking a box as being compliant with the DSA, while all these meetings have not so far led to any real world change and of big tech firms' behavior. And so there's also still this struggle from CSOs to get access to the data, because it's really hard to do all these risk assessments and to monitor the enforcement of these recommendations without getting this access. And so this is also the context that we have to consider. I think the fact, and to build this dialogue, we also have to consider that we live at a time where some tech companies openly call on the Trump administration to attack and undermine democratically passed legislation in the EU. And so how to build this dialogue, this is an additional challenge as well. As a way to, and just also I want to address Christina's question in the chat. To be honest, I'm not really sure that we should keep, it's not very, but that we should keep framing this work tech facilitated gender-based violence, and only because I feel that beyond the question of gender equality and protecting women's voices and marginalized communities' voices, I feel that we're really trying here to build safer online spaces. It has been said, and there's a real efforts and interest from policymakers. I will talk for the EU, into investing in this field, countering disinformation and building also safer online spaces. And I think that as we are moving forward on advocating for this recommendation, I think this is also something to consider, particularly because now all the anti-gender narratives and anti-democratic narratives are very deeply intertwined. They are definitely two sides of the same coins. And and this is definitely something we observe. If I take the example of I'm working with the International Media Support on a project on building digital resilience in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. And in these three countries, for instance, we definitely observe that the anti-gender narrative is intertwined with all the anti-EU narratives as well. So I think this is also a way, at least here in the EU, to frame this work when it comes to advocating for these recommendations. And I think Christina just yes. Therefore, how can we implement this safety measure? So I would say for the policymakers, I will also maybe try to frame it slightly differently as well. And I think that but maybe I'm happy to learn from the audience here. I haven't seen a lot of research evaluating the financial cost for the companies of not taking action, not only in terms of paying fines because of the DSA, but also because users are leaving these platforms. They don't feel safe anymore. Advertisers are maybe more skeptical because the how it works is a black box for them. And I think that there's a need for more evidence-based research on the costs for the platforms of not taking action. And as people who are willing to, I would say, change makers, people to willing to drive change, it's really interesting to, I think, to start developing this work. Yes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Elodie, and for going ahead and kicking off the Q&A. Great transition for us. So we have a couple questions already in the chat, and again, I encourage you all to use the chat function, and we can later move on. If you want to ask a question live, go ahead and raise your hand. But the first question is for Darini. What do you think of cross-industry collaboration efforts like Stop NCII, which are meant to reduce the burden of having to report abusive content on multiple platforms?
Thank you for that question. I personally love Stop NCII. And one of my favorite things is when I do a workshop, I show it and talk to people about how to use it, and the expression on their faces. They love it. They are astonished that such a thing exists, that it's there to support them. So it's a wonderful thing. And I think what is good or what works about this kind of collaboration is that it goes well with everything that we've been talking about, proactive prevention. And Stop NCII specifically, it empowers survivors and it shifts the power back to survivors. Because what we've seen with a lot of TFGBV incidents is that it causes this fear and shame, right? So when you can proactively prevent it, it really gives the power back to the survivors. And also you don't have to, because NCII, Stop NCII uses hashing, you don't have to upload the content. So again, it's safer, it's empowering. But again, there's always a but with anything that works, right? So when it comes to cross-industry collaborations like this, we often, at least in the context of Global South, it's cross-industry between civil society and tech companies. The state is always left out of the equation, right? So when it's cross-industry, the state definitely needs to be a part of that collaboration. So I think that's something we really need to work on. How do we bring them? Because they have the power to make things easier or make things more effective. The second thing is, including with Stop NCII, just because it exists, it doesn't mean all the platforms are part of it, right? For example, Twitter is not part of Stop NCII, from what I know. It is also not part of a lot of dating apps or dating platforms where a lot of non-consensual image sharing happens. And one of the biggest issues with platforms or services like this is that it works great but a lot of people don't know about it. And that's the sad part, right? Until I do a workshop, or until we do something, or we share it on social media, a lot of people don't know this exists or can help them. And this is where state services are helpful. When we do, for example, in Sri Lanka, when we do trainings for the local police, when we do trainings for the local counseling units, we talk about these resources. We say, and there's a lot of distrust because it's an international thing, it's in English, it's not compatible with our local language culture, but it still works, and you can still take inspiration from it, at least. But that's the thing, a lot of people don't know about it. So when it comes to cross industry platforms or services, it works great, but it really needs to be survivor centric, and also it really needs to include state sector more. I think that's my response.
Great. Thank you so much, Dharini. Our next question is for Sarah. How do these content-based interventions address the issues of asymmetrical cultural context across borders around what constitutes intimacy?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So thank you for whomever submitted it. To start, it is difficult, right? As Dharini just said, I wish I remember the quote, but just because something works doesn't mean there's not a but, right? A lot of what we talked about today are trying to emphasize what can be done, what is low hanging fruit in terms of what these companies could accomplish if they put, the capital, the resources, and the political will towards it. What you're asking about is difficult because a lot of times companies have an overarching global set of content guidelines. And as we know, there is not one universal set of standard as to what is considered intimacy, what is considered appropriate for a general audience versus what is something that maybe individuals do not feel comfortable engaging with or being exposed to or having on the general page. And so for that, I would say one, companies can take on more regionalized content moderation policies. TikTok actually does this, for example. It is costly. It is not necessarily efficient, but it does generally help alleviate this concern of a one-size-fits-all approach. But even if that were not to be undertaken, I do think that there are two things that can be done that can, while not solve every problem and the very thorny issues or the gray edge cases, I think can at least mitigate the harms that currently exist. And what that is one, we need to have a more participatory cultural calibration of AI models, given that these AI models are the mechanism that detects when content is either proactively reviewed or even reactively. If a user reports something, there's often AI models as part of the filtration process for when it is reviewed then by teams, or even in terms of what is amplified by a platform or not, or as I mentioned earlier with nudges, what triggers a nudge or not. So these AI models are generally built off, they reflect the biases of the internet. So often there have been studies that show that, let's say, nudity detection algorithms do not behave the same way or have the same accuracy rates for people of color. And that's obviously a huge problem considering the global population. If we look at also not just in media in terms of text, I had mentioned earlier that there are toxicity detection algorithms that exist for English, though of course that's even difficult given the dynamic, ever-changing nature of language, but it doesn't even exist for other languages. And so I think this has been an opportunity for, yes, the platforms need to invest more in it, but this is also where civil society does exist, and also in very interesting and dynamic social impact organizations that can bring their expertise to bear. And I would hope that platforms could engage with them in form of partnership. So one that comes to mind is actually, they were featured in UNFPA hosted a safety showcase earlier this year on TFGBV. The name is Sure.ai. And what they do is they are a bot that combats hate speech on social media with a special focus on Indian vernacular languages. So these typically being very low resource and not paid attention to by the platforms. There is also Policy, Pollicy, and I can put the links in the chat in a moment. But they have also been involved in trying to broaden the number of participants who can contribute to data sets that are used in these detection algorithms, and that better reflect those communities. So that is the first thing, at the very early stage, at the level of model development. And then I'd say the second thing is then localized human review teams. So proactive detection is helpful because, as we mentioned, safety by design and not putting the onus on victim survivors. However, we do enter into a really messy space where an image, let's say, of two people holding hands, the blunt approach of just no images of people holding hands can be posted on a social network, that doesn't make sense either. And no one is advocating for that by any means. But how do you then detect when it is consensual versus not? And so user reports do factor in. However, companies do not do a good job currently responding to user reports in a way that is, meeting the needs of survivors. And this is where I think more cultural education, all the way to who is responding to these reports, who is making the decisions as to whether or not something is considered violative or not. How are the policies that are written? Do they make enough room for cultural, local interpretations? And at the end of the day, trusting the survivor who is putting forth, hey, I don't like this image of me that is on there, please remove it. And that also, can't just be the platforms. I think it is stronger when it does involve external stakeholders like Stop and CII that was mentioned, but also very hyper local ones that, know the communities that they work with the best. And so Theo mentioned a lot of downsizing in terms of trust and safety teams and large platforms investing in community stakeholder management. However, I think we all need to collectively raise our voices to advocate and lobby for that to help at least improve the current state. It won't fix everything, but we can make a difference for many.
Thank you, Sarah. That's again a great segue into this another question from Christine. And Gabe, I'm going to ask you to address this one. I'll also put it in the chat because it's a bit longer, but what value or impact could smaller local or commercial tech companies and IT startups beyond the major big techs bring to this effort to prevent TFGBV through their design choices? And what incentives, either market, regulatory, or reputational, could motivate tech companies to prioritize safety or prevention earlier in the product or platform design?
Yeah, this is a great question. So thank you, Christine. I think there's a couple things, right? First, I'll start actually with the second point of like what incentives. From the question, I'm guessing you probably actually know some of these answers already, but there's of course there are fines, right? Like that's probably the most obvious thing. If people violate a law, we can send fines from governments. There's also the long-term financial viability, which we mentioned previously. These short-term gains in attention and engagement can, if they're from a harmful thing that people don't really want to see more of, this can have long-term negative effects, or just get people to have maybe highly engaged but short sessions where they're like, okay, I can't be on Facebook anymore, right? And then another thing, this is maybe the big scary headline for a lot of tech companies, right? And avoiding lawsuits. They don't want to be in the news for having done something horrible, or even have done something negligent, and then lawsuits, not just regulation, but lawsuits from people who have been directly harmed. Now, looking at what smaller tech companies can do, I think this is a place that we've already started to see with, with Twitter becoming X and then the proliferation of other possible replacements. One of the distinctive characters that you, as a tech company who's trying to set up a social media company, can do is be better at handling harm and violence than these larger companies. So the people who want to feel safe go to your platform instead of one of these other ones. Obviously, that doesn't work in all cases. There is the network effect, right? If my mom is on some platform that I don't necessarily like, I still might be on there just because she is. And um, so, yeah, I think the big thing is making it a distinctive characteristic of your design and your tech company to be better, to handle these things better, and demonstrate that it can be done. I think setting up partnerships early on in your development with CSOs or civil society organizations, and other like nonprofits or NGOs, governmental organizations. I think those are some of the biggest things. I am curious as someone, I come from tech, which that's where my origins lie. For those who have a different background, what do you guys think?
Elodie or Darini, do you have anything to add to this one? Or did Gabe cover it?
Just one thing I would add in terms of incentives or what kind of bargaining power we have in with countries like Sri Lanka, we're very small, so we don't have a lot of bargaining power. We could, say we'll take regulatory action. If you don't do this, if you don't make the users safe, we'll leave. They wouldn't really care because that's not a lot of people here. So in instances like that, what we realized is that regional coalitions are very helpful. So if you can't bargain as Sri Lanka or as Bangladesh or whatever, you can bargain as South Asia, which is a huge continent with a lot of people. So that usually helps because, as Elodie was saying before, these companies have a reputation cost model, right? They care about how they are perceived. So if an entire region is rejecting them, they don't take it well. So we found that regional coalitions or collaborations are very helpful in the global south. So that's something I would definitely recommend.
Lena, did you want to add to this one?
Yeah, I just wanted to say two things. I think Elodie and Theo were referring to like what's going on in the regulatory space, and there's a lot of focus on the risk assessment and then the mitigation. And it's and the more that we could, as civil society groups or people working in different ways, either inside of regulators or with government, could be specific in pointing to, hey, we believe that this risk mitigation effort has been proven successful. Here's some evidence. Can you tell us if you're doing that or not? It could narrow the conversation in a way that I think could be helpful because in some of my own experiences, even last week, around that risk assessment question, it ends up just drifting back to we took down the illegal content, right? And the questions around design and upstream, one of the goals of this report was to give, 8 things that people could ask for in terms of creating a healthier user experience. And it doesn't mean that it's all easy to just plug and play, but much of it is, right? Much of it are real choices that could be made that will not bring ruin financially to these platforms. And so the idea is, could we start asking for these things a little bit more specifically? Because then the conversation is like, well, if you're not doing it, why is that? Because here's the evidence that shows it works. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Theo, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a note, so a plus one to Drini's comment about working together, like coalition building as a more formidable force. In the conversations I've been listening into around legislative efforts, a big point of contention that companies have is a lack of interoperability. The idea that legislative efforts are disparate. In the US, we have 50 different states, and so you could have 50 different legislative systems, different laws that are not easily interoperable. And so I think that coalition building is applicable in that context as well, because when states coordinate their legislative responses, it makes it easier for companies to comply. Actually, it's a win-win. And so, for example, there is a senator in Connecticut, State Senator Maroney, who is coordinating AI legislation across the US. He has a convening of legislators that are meeting. And what I've seen now is states like Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont are actually mirroring each other's legislation because they're in conversation with each other. So I think that's a really important point. I wanted to frame that in the context of legislative efforts that are underway.
Elodie, go.
Yes, so of course, the what Darini said on the coalition and it's plus one, and also coalitions of regulators. Last summer we were in Dubrovnik in to discuss the UNESCO initiatives. They produced these guidelines on digital governance after a consultation of 10,000 people, and now they're in the process of discussing this. They've launched a network, I think, of 90 regulators. The goal is also to, let's say, to find a framework in countries where the tech regulation is still also ongoing, and to provide such a framework, which is very tricky, because before any regulation we want a democratic framework, and that's why I think these reports and these recommendations are so important. Is that these recommendations, I would say, are freedom of expression friendly. These are recommendations we can totally advocate for, without of course there's always misuse, but the potential misuse of this recommendation has been analyzed through this research, and that's why we all did this group of experts working on that, because the main we have to consider very different contexts, and most of the time the problem for CSOs of going together, building coalition and having very concrete recommendations is how it's going to be used in different contexts. And that's the kind of conversation we have also together. So some of us in different countries saying we want this, and other people saying no, it's not going to work in our country and don't push for that, and so on. And that's why I think when it comes to prevention by design, we mitigate the risk of these recommendations being misused when they are implemented. So this is a very important point, and that was also one of the key recommendations. I've led an expert working group on women and media for the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration, which is a key international text for women's rights. And we worked on, I would say, reviewing the recommendation on women in media that were done 30 years ago, and of course implementing recommendation on AI and mainly tech-facilitated gender-based violence and prevention by design, and where one of our key recommendation that we're going to advocate for, and through this global advocacy process.
Thank you very much. I believe we only have time for one more question. So I'm going to pose this. We're going back to intimate partner violence. And so Darini, please chime in, and anyone else as it might relate to red teaming. Where precisely do you see the risk posed by online platforms for intimate partner violence? For example, what kind of risk scenarios could platforms assess to determine whether their service poses a risk of IPV so they can adopt targeted mitigation measures? So I see this is going to be very much a blend of technologists and civil society teamwork. So
I'll start that off. Thank you. That's a great question. And there are so many risk scenarios. It's so interesting how digital platforms or devices can be weaponized to perpetrate intimate partner violence or domestic violence. One scenario, something that happens very commonly is, like I said, surveillance and monitoring, and how that what that looks like on some of these platforms are features like the last scene being available on platforms like WhatsApp, where you can see at what time this person was online. We see this a lot when we work with young people, where the boyfriend most often says, "Oh, you were online at 10:44, but I sent this at 10:15. Why haven't you replied to my text? Why are you ignoring me?" So the last scene feature comes there a lot. Things like Instagram stories or Facebook posts with geotags, they contribute to this, right? And also something that happens a lot, and we see this a lot with TikToks and influencers, also joint accounts. Joint accounts between couples and partners are becoming more and more popular. So these are some examples for surveillance and monitoring, and these are some things the platforms should definitely look into in terms of the risks they pose in terms of IPV. The second one is photos or any kind of visual content. I would love to hear from the technologists here for more about this. But we've seen that with IPV, or even in the cases of domestic violence where the person has left their partner, things like content or photos where they are tagged without their approval, because like I said, they don't know these things are by default, right? They don't know it exists. So tagging somebody without their approval, um things like facial recognition software and auto tagging always makes things difficult for some people, saying, "Oh, you said you were at your mom's house. What were you doing here? Who were you talking to?" Those kind of conversations also come up with some of these auto tagging features. And also, like I mentioned before, sharing passwords is a huge thing. And something that happens a lot when people who have low digital literacy or low tech awareness start some of these platforms or devices is, especially in Sri Lanka and Global South, you go to some, we call it a communication shop here. You go to this small shop and you ask the person there to set up the account for you. So they set it up with their email address or a random email address, and they set up the password because you don't know what you're doing. You just want to be on Facebook. You just want a TikTok account, right? So this kind of behavior where passwords are shared, accounts are set up by other people, are also a huge risk scenario that needs to be considered. And the last one I would say is in terms of survivors who have gotten out of IPV or DV, domestic violence situations. They leave the platform, or they delete their account, but there's always a chance of them wanting to come back, which is very valid, right? When they do come back, some of these platforms, because of the way they are designed, they would send a message or a nudge to the abuser saying, "Hey, Dharani's back," because they recognized my face, even though it's a completely different name. Or they recognize my name, even if the profile picture is different, right? They would say, "Dharani's back. Do you want to talk to her?" Or let's say I was abused on TikTok and I delete my TikTok profile and I go and create an Instagram profile. Because of the way these technology or platforms are designed, the abuser would get a nudge saying, "People you might know, Dharani." And these are problematic things. These are risks that people, survivors of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, have to face. So I would say looking at these things that are so obvious, that can get people into trouble or put them at more risk. These are definitely things that people need to look into.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. And I know we're almost at time, so I'll keep it brief. But I just wanted to plug. So Humane Intelligence had done an AI red teaming event with UNESCO back in the fall that Sarah coordinated, and just wanted to make sure that this was referenced as a really good way to assess the vulnerabilities of AI systems when it comes to issues like this one. We looked more broadly at TFGBV, but we also have looked through the lens of intimate image abuse, and we dropped a link in the chat so folks can check it out. But it's a great way to better understand where there are gaps and where models can be strengthened to mitigate the proliferation of information like this. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are at time. And I just want to take a moment to thank all of our wonderful panelists for sharing their time with us, their research, their perspectives. And thank you for everyone who joined us today and participated in the conversation. I dropped my email in the chat. And if you want to discuss further or get connected to any of our participants or our panelists, rather, feel free to send me a message. But yeah, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.